All right, well, good afternoon. My name is Cinda Stutzman. I am the Natural Resources Manager out at Wintergarden St. John's Nature Reserve. I have had the pleasure to work out there for the last 20 years. I do see some familiar faces here in the crowd, so nice to see you. If you are not familiar with Wintergarden, I did bring some pamphlets today. We are lucky to have 120 acres here inside of city limits that is being preserved and protected and enhanced for biodiversity, which is our topic today. Yeah, raise your hand if you've been to Wintergarden before. All right. Oh, I see lots of hands. Excellent. Is there anyone who wants to fess up they've never been there before? All right, I see a couple. We have lots of trail options, short, medium, long. We have lots of benches strategically located throughout the park. So as spring wildflowers have started blooming, there's going to be a lot of great things to see. Birds are migrating through. So when there's a better weather day than today, feel free to come out and visit. So biodiversity. Just realized, are you my button pusher? Okay, there we go. So we're going to answer a lot of questions today. I can run through the list real quick. We're going to talk about what it is. How do we measure it? How do we know our numbers? What do we know about it? Why is it important? What are the threats to biodiversity? And lastly, the important parts where we want to talk about what are communities doing to address the issue and what steps can you as an individual take. So it's pretty self-explanatory. Biodiversity, bio meaning life, diversity meaning, diversity. It's a pretty simple concept. So quite often we think of it as a list or a number, but it's not always that simple. There is a bit more to it than that. Typically, we like to measure things by putting a line on the ground somewhere, such as we have the nature preserve. What is our biodiversity at the nature preserve? Or we can look at Northwest Ohio. How much biodiversity is here? We can look at regions. We can look at states, and then we can do things like evaluate and compare locations. And so you have a lot of this going on when we bring up the concept of biodiversity. And I had fun making this collage of pictures. My friend Sherry is an English instructor by trade, but she's also an extremely patient person, and she's very observant. So she has taken a lot of great pictures of the critters that live in our park. She can spend an entire hour going on a very short hike, whereas I tend to get impatient. I'm like, I got to go look at more things. So she's very good, and you'll see her name come up again here in a few minutes. So for some of us, for scientists, naturalists, and the rest of us in the conservation fields, we look at biodiversity as a planetary health indicator. All right, it tells us something, whether what the numbers are, how they're moving, and things like that. I had fun with this slide too. You can tell I went for the rainbow effect. I had fun picking out one flower of every color. These are all flowers that occur at Wintergarden. Several of them have been reintroduced. Several of them, their populations have gone up with management over the last 20 years. So, all right. So how do we measure it? And I talked about, it's typically by counting the total number of species. That's the easy way to look at what is biodiversity. But there's also genetic diversity. So when you look at a population of an animal or a species, certain characteristics, if you have a population with a wide variety of gene diversity, then when something happens like a disease or predator-prey relationships, those can affect whether the species can survive or not. All right. And then there's also habitat diversity. And I picked these two pictures because these are some of our more rare habitats. So just like there can be rare species, there can also be rare habitats. The picture on the left is a classic picture of what an oak savanna looks like, and that's taken out at Wintergarden. And then the picture on the right is a picture of our wetland, which doesn't look like this anymore. This is our wetland in its infancy. If you've been out to Wintergarden anytime lately, you know that the entire periphery of that is full of willows and all kinds of other plants and wildlife, right? Trying to think, I wanted to talk to you about a little bit about the wetlands and savannas and how when we, as a society, put our minds to it and we start protecting some of these more rare and unique habitats, we're able to boost our numbers. So we're lucky. I've been working on savanna restoration for 20 years, like I said. And at the regional level, we've also had a lot of organizations to the north of the river, the Openings Metro Park area, Toledo Metro Parks, Kitty Todd Nature Preserve, the Nature Conservancy, have all put a lot of effort into this particular habitat, which helps the overall big picture. Wetlands as well, we've put a lot of effort into wetlands, both in the state and the nation. And within these habitats, we're looking for diversity. So I'm sure you've heard of the idea of a monoculture, where there's basically just one plant or one whatever growing in an area. So when we have you can think of the spectrum of there's diversity and then there's monocultures. And what we've been doing at Wintergarden, one of our biggest tasks had been to remove the garlic mustard from the woods. Because if we have nothing but a sea of garlic mustard, and they're crowding out all of those different spring wildflowers, then we don't have our diversity. And those wildflowers are the foundation, plants are the foundation of our habitats. So if we don't have a wide variety of plants, we will not have a wide variety of insects and all the other creatures we want to protect. All right, we'll go to the next slide. So how do we know our numbers? Well, at Wintergarden, we know from both staff and citizen scientist observations. All right, so for thousands of years, humans have been categorizing and listing things. All right, some of us love to list things or to look at lists. One of my favorite things to do is to look at lists of plants that were here historically and try to figure out where I can source the seeds and how I can make that plant grow at Wintergarden. So Wintergarden, we've got 20 years of accumulated data, and in the last few years, technology and phones and cameras are really changing the game out there as far as our ability to keep track of what's going on in the natural world. So even as a medium-sized preserve, it's still big enough for species to hide, and we're still able to add to these lists periodically. And we can look at the next slide. So here's our numbers so far at Wintergarden. Lots of plants. I focus on plants a lot. And again, like I said, it's the foundation. But then you can see we have a lot of other people who have chipped in and helped with our evaluation of what's going on out there. I don't know if anyone knows Jean Whitson, but she took it upon herself. She just decided one day, I'm going to study the fungus in the park. And she started taking pictures of it and uploading it to an app called iNaturalist. And then over the winter months, I can go into that program on the computer and I can be like, holy cow, I had only bothered to take in the time to list 6 or 7 funguses, the really obvious ones in the park. And this person went out of her way and took the time and took my list of 5 or 6 and took it all the way to 78, just because she took the time to look and to study and to record them for us. 151 birds. Not all of those birds are at the park all the time. We know we have migrating species. And even among the migrating species, sometimes there's a couple of birds on the list that have only been seen once in all 20 years, but one time is enough for us to say, you know what, that bird needed the park while it was migrating and it visited us, and we add that to our list. Again, my friend Sherry took it upon herself to keep track of all the insects and gave me a list. I'm hoping through using things like iNaturalist that we can cross-reference that and see how many other things are out there that we haven't recorded. I kept butterflies and dragonflies separate. Karen, again, just called me one day and she's like, you know what? You don't have a butterfly survey being done at your park. And I really like butterflies and I'm going to set up a survey. So she actually comes out every week to 2 or 3 weeks throughout the entire growing season, walks a very specific trail every time and records every single butterfly she sees. And then she actually turns this data into the state, to the state lepidopterists. And then these scientists are able to look at the big picture of butterflies and, you know, what their populations are doing over time. Let's see, we'll go on to the next slide. All right, so what do we know about it? Unfortunately, we know that it is declining at a high rate of speed, but I specifically picked this slide on purpose from the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. That's a big word. But the reason I picked this one is because all the other slides showed the downward trajectory and that was it. What I like about this one is this is why I got into the restoration business and the education business in the first place. I want to see us with a green line someday. I want to see that through the choices we make and the parks we protect and things like that, that we are able to bend that curve in an upward trajectory. So, and there's lots of people out there, we are currently working on trying to reverse this trend. So why is it important? Often when we think about biodiversity, we think of endangered species. And so nobody wants to see a species go extinct. I think most of us can all agree upon that. This is an awesome picture. This made me so happy that somebody caught a good picture of this bird. It's very elusive. It's not endangered. It's definitely a species of concern. And there's a lot of technical jargon that goes on out there with state versus federal and endangered and threatened and rare and things like that. But I do know that this is a species that's been in decline. We've been talking for years about how if we can do the savanna habitat restoration at Wintergarden right, maybe this bird will come back and be able to nest here. And just in the last couple of years, we've been starting to see this bird a little more often. I'm really hoping it decides to take up residence and use the preserve to reproduce. But again, the idea being biodiversity is important. We want to think about it because we don't want to see species go extinct. Again, planetary health indicator. But we also have other things that we lump into why biodiversity is important. And I'm sure some of you have heard about pollination and crop pollination. These are things we call ecosystem services. So if we are able to protect a wide variety of insects, then we will be protecting all of those critters that are part of our food chain and we might need them. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I really like blueberries. And blueberries don't have to be pollinated by like little native individual bees. So we have to look at that big picture. Also, ecosystem services, filtering and the storing of drinking water. And this is a picture of one of our rain gardens out at the community center. So those are another reason. That's another reason why biodiversity is important. And then we can go on to the next one. Yeah. So my last point that I want to drive home about why biodiversity is important. It might be our most valuable but least appreciated resource. We need to really think about it, especially into the future. It's a significant component of long-term sustainability goals. Okay. And I would also argue that we have a moral obligation to protect it. All right. So the threats. Quite a lot of them, and sometimes looking at the list can be overwhelming. And I know I've looked at the list before and been like, what can I do? But there are lots of things we can do. We'll hit on that a little bit in the end. For me, in my career, I have been focusing a lot on the habitat loss section of it. And within habitat loss, you can also talk about habitat fragmentation and degradation and land use choices. So, along with all these other things. And then, yes, number 2, invasive species. That's also where I've spent an awful lot of my time. We have made so much progress at Wintergarden with invasive species removal and plants bouncing back from the seed bank and the reintroduction of different species. So, go on to the next one. So it's important to keep in mind that these are all human-induced problems. But some species are actually able to adapt to human change. So overall, less habitat leads to biodiversity loss. But some species will increase with human land use changes, such as the cardinal and the deer. We do believe there are probably more deer and more cardinal in the state than there was at the time of European settlement, okay? Because they actually will increase in numbers because they like what the changes we've made. And then there are some species like the bluebird that bounce back with intervention much easier than others. Farmers, people in the rural communities noticed that the bluebird numbers were dwindling. Researched it, figured out that they like cavities. They like trees, holes in trees. So after the time of settlement, we have very few large trees left with holes in them that are near open areas, because they also need the insects, okay? So people started putting up lots of bluebird boxes. Lo and behold, our bluebird numbers bounced right back. But not all species will react that way. Some species are a lot more specialized in their needs. So a lot of times we refer to these as generalists and then specialists. Okay. And speaking of specialists, I'm sure many of you have heard about the monarch in the last couple of years. Their numbers are continuing to decline. We're hoping at this point, we would like to see them stabilize so that we can hopefully get their numbers to go back up. This one suffers from a lot of different problems. So not only is it suffering from habitat loss in Mexico, but it's suffering from habitat loss up here as well. So it's kind of like a double whammy. All right. We also have a reduction in the host plant population, the milkweeds. We've gotten so efficient with our farming that we now have to figure out where are we going to put the milkweeds so that we can keep this species going. And that's what we've been doing a large push on that. Yes.
It was on the radio yesterday about on NPR.
Yeah.
And some cities are saying you are not allowed to have milkweed growing on your property. It's a weed.
Well, and there is that perspective that we need to address. There are many different species of milkweeds. And so I would argue that although the common milkweed can go rogue, if it's planted in the right place, it's okay. But I can give you a list of milkweed plants that are not going to go rogue on you or spread by their roots that can fill that void.
I'd save them and give them to other people. Hopefully that they'll plant them of common kind.
Yes, so whether we're talking about natural areas like Wintergarden or your yards, it's this concept of the right plant in the right place. So you don't want to upset your neighbors by planting milkweed along the fence where it's going to grow under the fence and into their landscaping. So you just, those are things you have to think about if, you have to put it somewhere where you can keep it contained. If you want to plant that type of milkweed. But yes, I think they believe there might be some headbutting going on with this idea. And we need to problem solve it. I think there's a way to do it, obviously. So, that gets into a whole range of gardening techniques. I could give you a whole hour speech on that one too. So, so before we talk about what communities are doing and what you as individuals can do, there are many scientists and organizations that are calling for the 30 by 30. So this concept is to have 30% of land and water resources preserved by 2030. Now that's going to be a hard one to do. But by setting some sort of goal like that for us as a society, it helps us think about where do we need to go? Because even if we don't reach that goal, the idea is to strive for it. This is a concept that was brought up recently with the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity, which was this past December in Montreal. And there's a lot of other organizations that are starting to think about, how do we get from where we are now to 30 by 30? And just the worldwide statistic. So at a worldwide level, we are just at under 20% as far as land preservation, and we're at 10% for marine preservation from water habitats. So what are communities doing? And this is the slide that talks about a lot of what I've been doing for the last 20 years. All right, habitat restoration, where we have lands that are degraded, we can bring them back to life with more biodiversity. So land managers, people like me, people in the restoration field, we are in what's known as, I think of it as Noah's Ark mode. All right, so if we can protect as much variety as we can in places like Wintergarden and all those other nature preserves, then when we have the ability to expand, we have all of the resources there, if that makes sense. Okay, so these are like little islands, little gems where we can go to get more resources or the seeds or the plants we need to reintroduce them somewhere else. In the case of Wintergarden, 20 years ago, I actually started in the ditches. All right, I was out driving the ditches, finding those little plants that were still holding on, and I was collecting the seeds and bringing them back to Wintergarden. All right, and I went to a few other places, some of the county parks, some of the Toledo Metro Park areas, and we get just little bits of seeds here and there, and then use that. And then after the plants got established at Wintergarden, we've been doing a lot with the community and the children and the BGSU students, harvesting those seeds on site and planting them throughout the park that way. Let's see. Oh, yes. So remember that slide earlier where I showed that there was 338 plants at a minimum at the preserve. At this point, 65 have been reintroduced. Not all 65 are thriving, but we're doing what we can. 79 are non-native species, but just because a species is not native doesn't mean it's going to do ecological harm. Only 24 of those are invasive, and those are the ones we target as far as trying to really suppress their populations in order to provide room for all the other species. Let's see. Philosophically speaking, if we look at the big picture, what we need to do is move in the direction of making choices that result in less harmful human footprints. All right, so we need to find ways to meet human needs with fewer negative impacts. That includes things like changes in our agricultural system, embracing ecotourism, and rethinking approaches to land use. So at the local level, this is a picture of the community center where we've done a lot of work. In 2005, that was our first, the city and Parks and Recreation Department as a whole, that was our first turf avoidance move. All right, we started with 7.5 acres around the building where we planted prairie instead of turf, which, you know, turf has always been the standard up until recently. When we added 20 acres where 5 became soccer fields, the other 15 became an obstacle course. It's an old farm field with plants that are okay, but what we've been doing is trying to enhance the diversity out there. So now that we've kind of wrapped up work at Wintergarden, as far as the big picture, we've gotten all of that meadow replanted. Now we're starting to harvest seeds at Wintergarden and take them over behind the community center. Okay, so I put this one in here because this was a small but very fun project. This is Carter Park. I don't know if any of you have been over there lately or go over there to see any kids play t-ball or baseball or any of that fun stuff. It's a 1.5 acre woodlot and it's been mowed forever. Up until a few years ago, up until, I forgot to put the date in here. Oh, wait, there, 2014. Up until 2014, it was mowed, but it hadn't been herbicided under those trees. So it had a lot of good things going for it. It had a lot of good tree diversity. It had a lot of spring wildflowers still in the turf. So what we did, you can go to the next slide. Oops, there. We actually went in and we strategically did use chemicals at the end of the growing season. So all of the spring wildflowers had gone to sleep and the grass was still green, and we killed off the turf grass, and then we added more flowers. So you can see what happens here, that those are all spring beauties in that picture right there. So after you remove the turf, the spring beauties bounced back. And then we also have enhanced with a seed mix that brings in a lot of really awesome butterflies and things like that. So we took our biodiversity, I don't even know what our numbers were. Our numbers were probably something really low, and we basically doubled or tripled our biodiversity in just this 1.5 acre lot with a handful of seeds. A little more than. And I mentioned this a minute ago when I talked about our restoration efforts. We have been very community oriented and minded when we did our restoration, especially at Wintergarden. Wintergarden was restored, basically old school style. So when that Bordner Meadow was acquired, it was an old former farm field. It had a few plants in it. The city, the Parks and Recreation Department at the time, right around the time I was hired, could have just gone and bought a bunch of seeds and replanted the whole thing in one shot. But what we did was we did it incrementally over time by hand. And you can see here on the left, we got a sorority showing off all the seeds they've harvested. And then here on the right, this is me taking out some of our youth in our community to put those seeds back in the ground. See. Oh, I threw this one in too. All right, so the one on the left, sometimes what we have to do is we actually have to decrease some of our native plants. There's a couple of plants that can be very aggressive. So sassafras, sumac, Canada goldenrod, plants like that. I know, see, I saw a face like it. Yeah, so there's Canada goldenrod, and then there's like stiff goldenrod, and there's more than one type of goldenrod, just like there's more than one type of milkweed. And so, we only need so much Canada goldenrod in the world. What we need is, again, diversity. So this is actually the St. Al's on the left here. They were helping to maintain our diversity by actually killing off or curbing the enthusiasm of sassafras, which I love sassafras. All right. But at the same time, if we let the sassafras take over, then we don't have the diversity, just like if we let the garlic mustard take over, no diversity. But again, I try to make sure that we are making sure that children understand it's not just about, tackling the weeds, but it's about putting things back in. And you can see here on the right, a bunch of after-school volunteers from all the different schools, homeschool, public schools, private schools. They come, every couple of weeks in the spring and in the fall, and they help me put plants in the ground and put seeds in the ground. So back to the idea of turf reduction. This is actually a really awesome picture. I love this. This is the solar fields. You can almost see in the corner up there. Can you see the tiny little fence? So this is a place that's not publicly accessible. But the city has made sustainability moves in that we have, let's see, 7 acres that we have planted in prairie out there in lieu of just old farm field grasses or turf grass and things like that. So even though you guys don't get to enjoy it as citizens, it's making a difference out there. There are butterflies, dragonflies. I've seen deer. I've seen a great blue heron. So this is, a tiny little strip of prairie in the middle of farm fields. And what's neat about this place and like the community center, because there aren't any trees nearby, like Wintergarden has that big prairie, well, 2 prairies now, but it has a lot of big woodlots in it. All right. So when we go back to the idea of habitat diversity, there are some birds that do not like it. That's still not a big enough prairie for them. They feel claustrophobic. Okay, there's still too many trees. So when they're out in these prairies, so since there's farm fields around it, these are the prairies that are drawing in things like our eastern meadowlark. Okay, true prairie birds appreciate these habitats. So even though it's only 7.5 acres, it's still that wide open space view. So the bird feels like it's in a gigantic prairie. So that's where I've been seeing those birds. Let's see. Okay, so up next, we have a big planting happening here. Did anybody see or read about this in the paper? Catch a glimpse of this one? No, I'm not seeing any heads shaking, yes.
No paper.
Huh?
No paper anymore.
No paper anymore. That's right. You almost have to search for information sometimes when it comes to like your local information. So on the left, that is the wastewater treatment plant where your water is being pumped in from the river, cleaned, and then shipped down here for us. And on the right, that is your wastewater treatment plant. So that is, what is it? Poe and, I always forget. Poe and Dunbridge. Yes. Okay. Yep. So what you should start to see when you go the back way, go around to Meyer, this turf is starting to die. We have treated it with herbicides. I know sometimes it seems counterintuitive to use herbicides to protect or recreate nature, but it's a one-time, well, 2 or 3 times shot. And then after that, we will be planting, prairie habitats out here. And this is in an effort to increase habitat, reduce mowing, reduce our footprint, reduce the costs. It's still gonna cost us to maintain the prairie, but it's gonna cost us a lot less staff time, and we can put that staff time somewhere else, right? So what steps can individuals take? And if you remember that slide, that talked about the threats to biodiversity, this is basically what you can do to counteract each one of those threats. All right, so you'll see several times up there, plant natives. All right, so yes, invasive species, especially if you live near a nature preserve. Remove any invasive species you have in your yard because plants travel, birds eat the berries, and then they come back over to the park. And then they leave the berries and we end up with more invasive plants. So, I mean, once a habitat is restored, you always have to maintain it. So there's a lot of work up front, but then the work load slows down, but we will always have to be managing Wintergarden to an extent, right? So I'm sure some of you you've probably heard these things for the last 20, 30, 40 years, walk more, bike more, consolidate your errands, all those things, all right? Native landscaping. We've seen a large increase in people interested in landscaping with natives, whether it's, you don't have to plant a lot. All you have to do is put a handful in your yard to make a difference. So whether that's a rain garden, a garden that targets monarchs, pollinators. My big thing is, I think we need to pay more attention to shrubs, native shrubs, all those little tiny flowers in the spring are great for pollinators. The one on the left is one of my favorite plants I got my hands on for my own personal yard. And that's actually one of the native honeysuckles, not one of the invasive ones that we tend to terminate out at Wintergarden. It grows on my fence. It blooms almost all summer long. It brings in hummingbirds like you wouldn't believe. So if you're a hummingbird lover and you don't have that plant in your yard yet, that's my plug for that one. If you are interested in landscaping with natives, the Wood County Park District has a program next week online. And then there are plant sales. So on May 13th, the county parks have a plant sale out at the fairgrounds. It's become immensely popular. There's people, it's very crowded. It's like a mad dash to get your hands on certain plants before they're all gone. So the county parks are doing a fabulous service with that program. There's also some other opportunities. So if you're interested in getting your hands on more native plants, let me know. This was the slide to remind me to tell you to get the invasives out of your yard as well. So the BGSU students out having fun, getting rid of garlic mustard in the park, okay? Individuals, all right, so these are some of my top organizations that support biodiversity. So if you're looking for something to read or research or donate to, obviously Bowling Green Parks Recreation Foundation, their support helps us do a lot of stuff out at Wintergarden. There's the Friends of the Wood County Park District. Black Swamp Conservancy and Wild Ones Oak Openings Region Chapter, those are both regional. Black Swamp Conservancy, we would not have been able to protect our most recent 20 acres without the Black Swamp Conservancy helping to mediate that. They do a lot for Northwest Ohio. Wild Ones is the Native Landscaping Organization. So if you know anyone who wants to learn more about native landscaping, they're your go-to people. Ohio Natural Areas and Preservation Association is one of my favorites at a state level. They are helping to take care of all of our ecological gems. So like sometimes, like, has anyone ever heard of Gold Woods? Which is maybe 30-45 minutes to the west of here. It's a black swamp wood remnant, never been timbered, has spring wildflowers like crazy. It's not huge, but it's ecologically, it is a gem. So they had, there's probably 80 of those little tiny gems all over the state. I mean, there's even like a couple of them are pioneer cemeteries that are prairies that have basically never been tilled, so never been farmed, only dug to put a person in the ground. And so these are what we call virgin prairies. All right. So that's their role. And the Nature Conservancy has always been one of my favorite organizations. When I was in college, that was the first place I volunteered and learned about biodiversity, preservation, and how to take care of the land. So a lot of times when I'm doing my tinkering, as I call it sometimes, at Wintergarden, I look to them as the experts as far as habitat restoration and preservation. And this was my, if you want to read more, these are like the favorite books I've read in the last 10 years. And Douglas Talamay actually came and spoke here maybe 12, 13 years ago. We had him present. He also has this idea of, it's called Homegrown National Park, where if everybody just puts a handful of plants in their yards to help out the wildlife, then think about how big of an impact we can make. And I look at my block, I have 13 houses on my block, and there are some that are nicely landscaped, but they're all done with cultivars, so they're not necessarily doing anything for the wildlife. There's a couple with a handful of natives, but for the most part, the only place within this 13 house radius where there's lots of butterfly nectaring plants, lots of possibilities for other insects and things like that is my yard. All right, but think about just what if there was just 2 more yards on my lawn doing that, and how big of a difference that could make in our world. So I'm sure many of you have heard of Aldo Leopold, but when it comes back to biodiversity and protection, keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So trying to save as many species as we can before it's too late. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
I'm not sure where I read this, but it said to keep lawn mowing down to a minimum right now because of the bees.
Oh, the bees. Yeah, I think that there's a big push for letting dandelions go and not mowing as often. But then I've looked at the science behind all of that. So this is the time of year where you see all those memes. And if I were to make a meme, it would be plant more native shrubs, plant more spring wildflowers. That's gonna do more good long-term than letting all your dandelions go or letting your turf grass go too long and upsetting your neighbors. So, but I'm looking at it from a certain perspective, and then there is benefits to some dandelion. I don't go crazy terminating dandelions, but I'll be honest, I don't really like them in my landscaping. And if I let my dandelions go rogue and they get into my neighbor's yard, and then my neighbor really doesn't like them and is putting all kinds of chemicals on their lawn to get rid of them, then what kind of good have I done? So again, I go back to what is it they really need? And I try to research it and read up on it. And what we're saying is, if that's your concern, it's spring blooming shrubs and trees is your solution. And we do want to leave things a little messy for critters to have a place to hide or pupate, for caterpillars and things like that. So we do need to be a little bit messier, have places where we leave the leaves for things to overwinter.
What was the red plant that you said was a bush or a shrub that you?
Oh, the vine
Yeah,
that covers my fence, that's a
Yeah.
coral honeysuckle. Coral honeysuckle, yes.
When you say chemicals,
Mhm.
you wouldn't mean Roundup, would you?
For what?
To get rid of things. When you're-
In the restoration field, we do use chemicals periodically, but we try to keep our chemical usage to a minimum. So in order to plant the prairie at the wastewater treatment plant, we have to use the chemicals a couple of times in order to get rid of the turf, in order to plant the seeds and give them their best shot of growing. So, but once that's done, then we don't have to put 2,4-D on the turf every year after year to get rid of the weeds in the turf. So we do use chemicals, but we try to be sparing with them. We try to make good choices with them. But it's hard to get away from chemical usage 100% when you're trying to recreate a prairie.
I just keep reading about how detrimental their use is to pollinators,
Mhm.
the bees that don't survive because they get infected with Roundup.
Yes, so unfortunately, hopefully, there's not a lot of, we hit it so early in the season that there was minimal collateral damage as far as those kinds of things are concerned. But yeah, when we do things like spray Roundup 5 times a year along, fence edges or railroad lines or, those kinds of places, then yes, then I feel like that maybe there's other ways we can consider managing and keeping those areas open. Usually when you're spraying Roundup, you're trying to kill off everything, except unless it's, Roundup Ready soybean and things like that. So again, that's where we go into, we need to reconsider our agricultural systems. They say a lot of times, with the agriculture, having pollinator plants nearby and pollinators actually helps boost the crops. So it's good for them. So we just need to find a way to integrate those systems. And there's a lot of work being done in those areas.
how many types of dragonflies are in this area, do you know?
As far as in Northwest Ohio or Ohio as a whole, I would have to look that up again. I'm gonna bet more than what number we have.
Do they go through the same stage as a butterfly, like from a caterpillar to a?
Very
dragonfly?
similar, very similar. So the female dragonfly will lay her eggs on the water or on a plant stem, and then they hatch. And so the larva, similar to a caterpillar, lives in the water, and they eat a lot of mosquito larvae, and then they crawl up on a plant stem, and then they go through that process of metamorphosis, and then they crack open, and the dragonfly flies out. So
And
it's
then
fun.
after that, what, do they just die off, or do they mate and then die off?
Then they mate and then they die off. There's actually a handful of dragonflies that do migrate some, but for the most part, they will lay their eggs and then the cycle will continue. So, yes.
The flowering trees that are planted around downtown, along
Mhm.
the parking lots and downtown, are those native or invasive?
The ones on Main Street, the ones that were flowering recently last month or last few weeks, yes, those are non-native. They are calorie pair. They are the ones that
Those are the calorie.
those are the calorie pair. Those are the ones that people in my profession are asking people not to plant anymore. And we can't plant them anymore because we've been asking for a number of years and it was legally changed. I mean, you cannot buy them, you cannot produce them anymore, you cannot sell them anymore in the state of Ohio. Because they have wreaked so much havoc on our natural areas.
I was looking, and I didn't even realize those were colored
Yeah.
theirs, but the ones they're more, they flower a little bit later, it's a very, and they're around in the parking lots, and I noticed them down the residential streets.
Okay,
And I thought I did a check on them last year and they were an invasive as
Okay.
well.
and they could be, a lot of times our invasive plants have come from the horticultural industry, but we're working with horticultural industries more and more, people at the state level. We're trying to make sure that when cultivars are created, that we don't end up with a calorie pair problem, that they were supposed to be sterile.
So,
And then they weren't. So sometimes nature has other intentions. Yes.
why didn't the arborists, I mean, these were just planted recently in the last 4 or 5 years.
I think it's been longer than that. It's been closer to 12 or 15. I think when those were planted, we were right on the cusp of figuring out that this was an invasive species. I mean, the horticultural industry created these for a reason. These are the perfect street trees. They're gonna be great. They grow fast. They look nice, the small leaves, you know, all these attributes we thought we needed in a street tree. And then all of a sudden we had to pump the brakes and reconsider.
I was
Yeah.
looking at the calorie pairs, and it's the other ones, the one parking lot I know they have them around is the one across from the farmer's market, the one behind, you know, down
Mhm.
there, but I know friends who the city has planted them, you know, as street trees.
It might be barberries, it could be any number of things, but
Yeah.
I think with our last arborist, I was starting to see a lot more concern for making sure we're including native plants, not just planting cultivars that aren't invasive, but lumping in native plants as an option. And I think with our most recent arborist, Adrian, I think we're gonna see more and more possibilities of native plants in our streets, on our sidewalks and around there.
So are those pear trees that Jean said were downtown and
Mhm.
I see them all over? Are those the ones that they're getting rid of and they're gonna start cutting down?
They may have to start replacing them. I'm not sure what the game plan is, big picture, but the idea is to slowly over time. I mean, these trees age out pretty fast anyway, and from what I understand, urban trees in general, because they're not getting a lot of space, you know, at the root, they only get so much water. Street trees are they're always a very stressed tree. So, and these calorie pears also, you know, a windstorm comes by, half the tree will just fall off. So as these trees age, I think the idea is to replace them incrementally with new trees, with more variety of trees. And it's about the right tree in the right place. And unfortunately, our town is not the only town that made this mistake 12, 15 years ago. People really thought the calorie pear was gonna be this great, awesome street tree, and we were wrong. So, and like we have to do when we realize we're doing something wrong, like, you know, negatively affecting our biodiversity, we need to take a step back, think about it, problem solve, and move forward with new ideas and approaches, so.
Could you talk about controlled burn?
Yeah, so we do use controlled burns as a habitat management tool at Wintergarden. We've been doing that off and on for 20 years. We tend to do a burn about every 2 years. We kind of went through a spell where we were having trouble getting fire on the ground, so this March was the first time we had done a burn in about 4 years. So it was long overdue. What fire does in certain habitats, not every habitat is a fire adapted habitat. All right, but our oak savannas, our prairies, oak woodlands, those need periodic fire to be rejuvenated. So what it does is it takes all that buildup of duct. So it releases the nutrients go back into the soil. It opens things up for new things to germinate. And invasive species typically do not react well with fire. There's some that do like fire. They have to use other tools. But for the most part, it also opens up, it decreases the woody plants, whether even if those are native woody plants. So like how I mentioned, sometimes we have to get rid of sassafras, there's too much sassafras or blackberry or sumac. Historically, there would have been thousands of acres of prairie and fire would have been coming through periodically and keeping that balance. So when I manage Wintergarden, sometimes I feel like I'm micromanaging the habitat. Because, but if we don't keep some of those woody plants suppressed, like I only have one place where there is sweet fern growing. And it's a threatened plant. So if I don't keep the sassafras out, I will lose that plant altogether. And I'm just talking one plant, okay? Remember, I'm trying to keep an eye on 300 and some plants and trying to keep that diversity up. Because the more plants we protect and have, the more, all the creatures, so on and so forth up the food chain, because some creatures are picky, monarchs. Caterpillar only eats, it's not one plant, one species of type of plant, so they will eat 10 different milkweeds. But a lot of people don't realize that there's more than one type of milkweed. So, but then you have other plants like the lupin. There's a butterfly up in the Ogopones region that is struggling. And it eats one plant, the caterpillar, one plant.
I just bought an orange milkweed that you have to plant by seed. And it's not supposed to be invasive or invasive.
Yeah, it doesn't spread by roots. It's
Right.
probably butterfly weed,
Yeah.
or butterfly milkweed is its name. That is one of my favorite.
I like the
milkweeds.
color of the flower. It's a pretty flower, so.
Yeah, and like my
Try
second
it.
slide, in has the, with the flowers,
Like,
has that.
yes. For dragonflies,
Mhm.
how do you attract them to your? Is there a special plant that they like?
I actually, feel like I saw something recently that said you can actually garden, like there are certain plants that might do better than others, but they have to have that water to reproduce.
So they have to be near ponds
Near
or
some sort of pond or water
house.
source.
right near?
I don't know, I see dragonflies flit through my yard and I'm in downtown Bowling Green, so they do flit through. And there might be some plants you could plant that might attract them. I feel like I saw something like that recently somewhere. It's
Yeah.
probably a meme.
The Blackstone Conservancy is having a walk tomorrow out to the Rookery. And it's right across from Eastwood School, that's where their headquarters is, and where you walk back to the Rookery.
And that is a neat treat, because that place, unlike a public park like Wintergarden, which is open all the time. Places like this Black Swan Conservancy, you're talking about Bell Woods, which is across from Eastwood. I haven't been there in a long time, but I had that on my list of things to try to do tomorrow. The Trillium in that park or preserve is just to die for.
But it is very swampy.
It is, you have to
If
have
you
your rubber
go,
boots.
Just wear old shoes that you don't care anything about, or boots.
That's right.
Because it's a swamp.
It is. It is very swampy. I have a picture of my kid when he was about this big. And he's got his rubber boots on and then the water's up to his ankle. But we went out, we saw the Rookery, we saw those trilliums. It's a neat place if you've never had the privilege to go
This
out
is a
there.
special day from noon to 4.
Yes,
to lunch.
and there's food trucks.
And
Get your lunch there too. You can lunch and learn out at Bell Woods.
In the rain.
In the rain.
When I taught fourth grade, we had an insect unit that we had to do, and I was particularly interested in the monarch, and I went with a lady that's known as the butterfly lady in Toledo, and anyway, I brought the project back to my classroom, and the kids learned how to go out and look at the underside leaf to look for the little pearl egg, and we brought them back in when my dad made cages, and we raised them up, we fed them, then we